and fellow at the Law Institute in Sydney. And he is one of the most perceptive analysts of Russia, China, and global affairs. I think you've been long recognized for your clear-eyed analysis of Russian statecraft and Russian ability to situate, your ability to situate Russia's behavior within the wider global dynamics. Your book, Russia and the New World Disorder, was shortlisted for the Pushkin House Prize in 2016. Your other works, including Axis of Convenience, On the Russia-China Relationship and Russian Foreign Policy in the Post-Soviet Era, have shaped how many of us understand Moscow's strategic culture. And Bobo's latest shorter writings include Convergence and Divergence, China-Russia Relations in the Age of Trump, that was published with us, with Nest. There are a couple of copies here, or they're also on our website. Also, Gaza and Reimagining International Order, and the Ukraine Effect, Demise of or Rebirth of the Global Order. So, Bobo, I think your new book arrives at a very timely moment, just the very least to say. It also invites us to consider a world where disorder is no longer temporary, but it's the structural condition in which we have to live and in which we have to operate. And for many of us, I think this is a very uncomfortable argument. Forces us also to think beyond familiar binaries, West versus non-West, democracies versus autocracies, and instead perhaps examine how systemic disorder shapes state behavior, alliances, and the possibilities for cooperation, if there are any. But without further ado, Bobo, I would like to give you the floor so you can present your book, the arguments, and then we'll move into the discussion. So the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Katia. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to present my book, and also present my book in front of so many friends as well. It's a real pleasure. So I should probably say something about what I'm trying to do with the book, the essential thrust of the book. And then maybe in the second half we can talk a little bit about how, where the war in Ukraine, the West's engagement with Russia, where does this all fit in? And then I'll finish up with a few final words. So, as consistent with the title, I argue that the world today is more disorderly and anarchic than at any time since the end of the Second World War. The US-led post-Cold War rules-based international order has unraveled, and nowhere more so than in Europe. Now, although the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine stands as the most egregious breach of international rules in recent times, this unraveling of the post-Cold War liberal order has been an ongoing process over the last 2 decades. It's partly a function of the changing relativities of power, but it is also the outcome of multiple Western policy failings. And I think in this connection, we can identify what I call 6 stages of suicidal statecraft in Western policy making, but in fact, I think we can increase the number to 7 now. So what are these 6? Well, the first one is the 2003 US-led invasion of Iraq. Then there's the 2008 global financial crisis. The third one is the, frankly, feeble response of the West to Putin's 2014 annexation of Crimea. Then there's the extraordinary dysfunction of the first Trump presidency. And then the perhaps the worst aspect of that was the self-centered American, but also Western response to COVID-19. And then this is followed by the progressive disintegration of Joe Biden's foreign policy. And finally, today we have the unrestrained excesses of Trump 2.0. Now, this series of Western policy failures has underlined that the so-called rules-based international order, at least understood by the West, is no longer fit for purpose. It has invited rule breakers of the world to unite and to do their worst. Now, Russia has been the worst transgressor, but Western governments are also culpable. Their failure to observe the norms they purport to defend, their level of self-delusion, self-entitlement, and complacency, their willingness to overlook rules busting whenever it's convenient. And all these have combined to create an existential crisis of international order. Now, it's tempting to think, oh, well, look, okay, the rules-based international order's gone and there'll be a new order, rather like buses, another one will come along. But in fact, there's precious little sign of this. The idea of a UN-based order is essentially a fiction. The multipolar order that a lot of people talk about, the concert of great powers, this is an aspiration of some rather than a reality. Xi Jinping's shared future for humanity is full of platitudes and has minimal content. And Donald Trump's America First vision offers little or nothing to other players and is therefore unsustainable. But more broadly, there is no consensus over the rules of engagement and coexistence. International law, such as it is, has given way to the rule of lawlessness, a kind of Hobbesian state of nature. And meanwhile, the world faces a perfect storm of threats and challenges: runaway climate change, the likelihood of more frequent and more serious pandemics, stagnant global poverty, the technological revolution, the mass disinformation, and of course, our old favorite, geopolitical confrontation. So what are we going to do about it? We can see that the situation is terrible. So how do we begin to address this? And most of the book is about how we go about trying to meet this extraordinary challenge. Revitalising global order is the central task of our time, not because order is inherently virtuous, but because without some measure of it, we will not be able to address the many challenges and threats before us. But it's evident that the usual prescriptions about international order are unworkable. We need to rethink global governance. As the world changes, so must the nature and shape of order itself. But what does this mean in practice? Well, in my book, I propose a new internationalism based on three broad principles: a larger view of self-interest, greater representativeness and inclusiveness, and the acceptance of flexibility and diversity. So just break it down a little bit. Self-interest. Well, self-interest is the foundation of any international order. So there can be no question about, states, governments, they must transcend self-interest. No one in the history of the world has ever managed to do this, and they're certainly not going to succeed today. But it is possible, and indeed necessary, to take a larger view of self-interest. And I think three elements are critical here. The first is to recognize the interconnectedness of things. The world is fractured along multiple lines, ideological, economic, and so on, but it is more interconnected, more interdependent, and if you like, more globalized than it's ever been. Whether we like it or not, and most of the time we don't like it, our self-interest is intimately tied to that of others, whether it is in addressing global threats such as climate change and pandemic disease, or confronting challenges such as technological transformation and the information revolution, or even checking the anarchical tendencies of a super rogue state like Russia. The second element of self-interest, a larger view of self-interest, is a proper grasp of time. Threats such as climate change are simultaneously long-term but also urgent. Understanding time also means perseverance in policy implementation. And this is especially critical not just in mitigating climate change, which is a challenge of many decades, but also in resolving or managing conflicts such as Gaza and, of course, the war in Ukraine. And the third element of a broader view of self-interest is what I call practical empathy. And I don't want people to think, oh, well, this is about singing Kumbaya and clapping hands and so on. No, it's not. And it should never be confused with approval or support. Basically, practical empathy is about putting yourself in the shoes of the other person, the other country, trying to understand why they act in certain ways and responding accordingly. Empathy, it's a rather unfashionable word, is key to collective problem solving. Now, moving to the second element of a new internationalism. Well, if self-interest is the foundation of any viable international order, then representativeness and inclusiveness are indispensable to its functioning. An unrepresentative international order is a contradiction in terms. By ignoring the self-interest of the many, it sets itself up for failure. And two priorities are key here. The first is rectifying the underrepresentation of global south countries in international institutions. If democracies want the support of such countries on issues such as Ukraine, then they have to involve these countries much more in global decision-making across the board. The second related priority is a policy agenda that reflects the needs of the majority of nations. We cannot expect global south countries to take an interest in what happens in Ukraine or about the threat that Russia poses when we show minimal interest in the issues that matter most to them, such as debt relief or climate financing. And this has become particularly clear over the course of the war in Ukraine. And then the third element is flexibility. The only viable international order is one that is able to accommodate and moderate substantial differences in viewpoints, values, and interests. Flexibility is crucial. Dogmatism of whatever kind is unsustainable. A flexible international order in practice would dispense with the illusion of universal values. It would recognize the existence of multiple contradictory value systems. On a practical note, it would mean an end to the often gratuitous and morally dubious lecturing of Western governments to others. A flexible mindset also means a focus on what states do in the international arena rather than on their mode of governance. Now, as a liberal, this hurts me, this pains me. But in fact, there is no workable alternative. And incidentally, it's simply not true to say that authoritarian regimes are invariably more aggressive than democracies in the international arena. You can make that point about Russia, but I think you're really struggling to make the point about China. So, moving to sort of the war in Ukraine and European security. In my view, the war in Ukraine is a litmus test, not so much for the Western liberal order, which was already on life support, but for the very idea of international order based on rules and norms. It's also a critical test of European capacity, will, and credibility. If Western governments, particularly European governments, fail this test, it'll not just be a moral defeat, but a crushing reverse for their political and security interests. And this is particularly true of Europe, which has far less margin for error than the United States. Now, of course, any defense of European interests incurs major risks. Let's not pretend that it's going to be cost-free. However, the path of procrastination and denial is fraught with far greater dangers. Ukraine represents the front line for Europe. If Ukraine loses, Europe loses, and it loses big. Now, in terms of policy on Ukraine, the emphasis, I would argue, needs to be less on punishing Russia than on supporting Ukraine, enhancing its military capabilities, supporting its integration into Europe via accelerated membership of the EU and NATO. It means providing meaningful security guarantees, i.e. not a rehashing of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. And it means, and I know there are risks, using Russian frozen assets to provide a financial lifeline. Now, you can inflict further sanctions on Russia or pursue various forms of retributive justice, like war crimes trials, but I think that would be far less effective. On international order more broadly, European governments, not least Britain, must appreciate that their interests are not the same as Trumpian America's. This is no time for pious notions about shared transatlantic values or special relationships. Now, this doesn't mean that the transatlantic relationship is over, but this relationship is likely to undergo a fundamental transformation no matter who sits in the White House. The future of transatlantic cooperation lies in a much more practical, less sentimental engagement, based on sometimes convergent interests rather than shared values. Now, this is not about so much European strategic autonomy, but rather European strategic flexibility. European unity has never been more vital, but it's important to get away from abstractions like one Europe and instead focus on collective action in pursuing concrete common interests, whether it's in trade, security, technology governance, or countering disinformation. Now, I just want to quickly say some words about engaging with Russia. If there is a positive out of Putin's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, it is that it has discredited the false hopes that have long undermined Western policy towards Russia, such as Merkel's Wandel durch Handel, change through trade, and the sort of fanciful pretensions of successive US presidents that they could fix or park Russia. In dealing with Russia, European policymakers need also to understand the limits of their direct influence. So any hope of changing Moscow's behavior for the better will not come from lecturing it or sanctioning it. It will come from proving the effectiveness of Western and particularly European actions, not words. Governments more broadly need to re-establish the connection between liberal values and effective governance. That connection has been pretty much severed in recent times. Europeans must also recognize that on Russia, they're on their own. They're not going to get any support from the Americans, or certainly not under Trump. obviously not from China, nor indeed from the global south. At least over the next decade, and probably much longer, the future of European security lies in the hands of Europeans themselves. And in the meantime, and this is probably not going to be very popular among many people, European governments should look to keep open or even revive channels of communication with Moscow. As noted earlier, this in no way implies approval or support for Russia. But even with the most egregious of regimes, it's important to take every opportunity to understand their thinking and to communicate our own. Now, just a couple of final words here. There's no question that the contemporary global picture is looking particularly grim. But we shouldn't dismiss the prospects of a viable international order or society. What seems improbable today can become reality under the pressure of changing circumstances. And just in the last few decades, we can look at the sudden end of the Cold War, the emergence of Franco-German Entente after 2 centuries of enmity, German reunification, or China's spectacular rise after the death of Mao. Not too many people predicted any of these things, and yet they happened. So it's important not to sort of wallow in the slough of despond. Now, as the existential nature of challenges like climate change, technological transformation, major power confrontation hits home, governments will have to find ways of working with each other, regardless of their geopolitical or ideological differences. And indeed, there's an analogy here with the aftermath of the Second World War, when nations of very, very different stripes came together to re-establish an international order. So the rules-based international order, as designed and understood by the West, that's over. That was a product of a unique combination of capacity, vision, and will. But I argue in this book that a new rules-based order is feasible, one that is flatter and fairer, that enjoys greater legitimacy and credibility, and that is ultimately more resilient and effective. And in any case, do we have a choice? We have no choice but to try. Fatalism is not just cowardly, it's also hopelessly impractical. And so is relying on approaches that are either past their use-by date, that lack substance, or a one-way ticket to more anarchy and conflict. So the new internationalism I advocate reflects the reality that we either live and flourish by working together to meet common threats and challenges, or we go down divided. We are not, I argue, obliged to accept a dystopian future. We do have agency, and it's time we acted on it.
Well, thank you very much, Bobo. That was a very impressively laid out argument covering so many aspects. And before I open the floor, I would like maybe to pick up on a few themes that you mentioned and ask you some a bit counter arguments,
sure.
Perhaps. Yeah. So the first one was about your self-interest, that your larger view of self-interest. How today, when we see across Europe and the United States, we see the resurgence of radical right, which on the contrary focuses on the narrower exclusionary definition of national interest. And this is what central governments, liberal governments are now trying to steal voters against or persuade voters to vote for them. But they still must appeal to some of the themes which radical right particularly focuses on. So how would you suggest Western governments then should behave in order to, what should their policy be if they have to be indeed embrace this wider, larger notion of self-interest, but at the same time, they have to appeal to wider constituencies and perhaps win those voters who are now moving or leaning more towards radical right?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would answer that in the following way. First, I would take issue that the radical right represent a significant portion of the electorate. I think what the radical right do well is they exploit, and at a certain level, in a political sense, I don't blame them for doing this. This is a natural response. They exploit the discontent of people about their situation. So what they do is they focus on certain sort of buzz issues as a way to simplify their discontent and tap into it. And it works. Now, the problem, what disappoints me is that centrist governments, not least the current Labour government in this country, are falling into that narrative, that they're responding to the challenge of the far right on the far right's terms. They present no positive vision. They instead go down the path of scapegoating. Now, as long as they do that, they lose. A centrist government will always lose to the far right if it goes down the path of outright negativity and scapegoating. They have to give people a reason to believe in a future in this country and in other Western democracies. So what I spoke about before is the connection between liberal values and effective governance. And that connection has been severed or extremely eroded. So one of the reasons why the far right is able to tap into people's discontent is because people feel that they're so much worse off. They feel that this is a government that doesn't really care about their living conditions, that has allowed public services to erode. And what governments need to do is address these central problems first, rather than the symptoms of it. They need to address the causes. And too few governments have either the vision or the political will to take this challenge on. It's almost like it's too hard. But one of the things that's very interesting is, yes, the far right have risen in this country, but so is the Green Party, polling almost as well as both the Conservatives and the Labour Party. The Lib Dems have also have a popularity rate that's very very close to those two. I think it's 16, 16, 14, 14, something like that. And so, there's nothing wrong with presenting a positive vision, but people have to feel that you believe it and that you're prepared to drive it. And I think people have lost faith. And so that's why they fall into simplified narratives. They become quite seductive.
Yeah, absolutely. My next question would be about your concept of flexibility and values in particular. That's something that struck me. If we sort of accept, I guess, your wider idea that there isn't a universal system of norms or values, isn't it not legitimizing the authoritarian claims that, well, every governance system is valid?
Yep.
And how do we then stand up for democracy? Or we don't need to stand up for it then?
Okay, so a couple of points to make here. Let's start with our own democracies. Let's improve the quality of democracy, transparency, accountability, rule of law in our own societies. Because right now we're not doing a very good job, or at least many Western democracies are doing a particularly bad job. Nowhere worse than Trumpian America, but there are other examples as well. So the problem, if you don't look after democracy and the rule of law in your own country, then you have less than zero credibility when you preach democratic and liberal norms around the world. People just laugh at you. Because one of the reasons that the Russians and Chinese are able to sort of work with the Global South is because the Global South have no illusions that these people care about norms. They know they're driven by naked interest, self-interest. At least, but when they look at the Western leaders, democratic leaders, they think, what a bunch of hypocrites. They don't practice what they preach. They go easy on their friends and hard on their enemies. And so they apply all sorts of double standards. And look, I'm not happy about the authoritarian regression that's happened. Well, Freedom House says now we're up to 19 years. So 2 decades of democratic decline around the world. It's pretty terrible for a liberal like myself. But we've tried the other things. We've tried preaching values to others. We have gone for democracy promotion. We have had liberal interventionism. Mm-hmm. How's that gone for us? How's that gone for these countries? And how's it gone for the credibility of Western liberalism around the world? So ultimately, it's about choosing the least bad option. All options are bad. Let's be quite clear. But it's about picking the least bad one. And I think ultimately, let's focus on trying to shape norms of international, interstate behavior rather than worrying excessively about the mode of governance in a particular country. That does, I have to admit, mean tolerating bad human rights abuses, a lot of things that we personally in the West would find thoroughly offensive. But I don't see that we have a practical alternative.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bobo. I would like to move to zoom in now on Russia, our main, one of the main topics today. And I think from your writing and from many people's assessments here, Russia has become a disruptor. And I wonder, in your view, do you think Moscow has any vision for the international order, or is it driven by destabilizing the West and by disrupting the international order altogether?
I think Putin has a plan A and a plan B. So Putin's plan A, in a perfect world from the perspective of the Kremlin, it is a tripolar order. It is an order where there's a dynamic balance between the United States and China, with Russia as the geopolitical pivot. And so although Russia is much weaker than the other two great powers, it's able to play in the margins. It's able to tilt the balance here and there. And so it exercises a level of influence disproportionate to its actual capabilities. Now, a lot of people would say that that's a thoroughly unrealistic objective, and I would too. So that brings us to plan B. If you can't get the order that you want, then better a disorder. Because the beauty about disorder is it not only upsets the West, but it also allows comparatively weak players to exercise disproportionate influence. It's much easier to be a disruptor of international order than a creator. So the messier, the more disorderly the world, the more opportunities there are for Russia to play.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Bobo.